Every year, dozens of fighters make their UFC debut. In 2022, one debut stood out for a completely different reason. Not because the fighter was elite, not because he shocked the world, but because he arguably shouldn't have been there at all.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
This is the story of Askar Mazharov, the fighter who didn't just chase the UFC dream, he allegedly built an entire fake reality to get there, and somehow, it almost worked. The story doesn't actually begin with Askar Mazharov. It begins in Odessa, Ukraine, with a young fighter named Artur Shatakov. Like thousands of fighters around the world, he fell in love with martial arts early and dreamed of reaching the highest level. He turned professional in 2013 at just 19 years old, and his debut lasted 39 seconds. He lost by submission in the first round. Not great, but also not career-ending. Plenty of future champions lost their first fight. It happens. So, he trained harder, waited a year, and came back determined to fix his mistakes. Unfortunately, the second fight ended exactly the same way.
Again? Not again.
First round submission against another low-level opponent. At this point, it was concerning, but sometimes fighters just start slow, right? Then came fight number 3, another first round submission loss. Slight improvement though, he lasted 90 seconds this time. Progress, technically. And it gets worse. The opponent who would beat him would later retire with a 1-3 record, meaning Shatakov was literally his only win. Not exactly the resume you want while dreaming about the UFC. After starting his career 0-3, Shatakov made a decision. Instead of climbing through tougher competition, he started fighting extremely weak opponents. And when I say weak, I mean historically weak. He went on a 3-fight win streak. On paper, that sounds like a comeback, but the fighters he beat had a combined career record of 0 wins. Not 0 wins before fighting him, 0 wins ever, even after their careers ended. Most of them were making their debut. Some never fought again after losing to him. One opponent came back for another fight, lost again, and retired 0-2. That's not matchmaking, that's basically stat farming. There were even discrepancies about how many fights actually happened. Some databases listed duplicate wins, others didn't. Either way, Shatakov managed to drag his record back toward respectability. Feeling confident again, he stepped up in competition, finally fighting someone with actual wins. And he immediately got knocked out in the first round. From this point forward, his career followed a painfully predictable pattern. Whenever he fought someone legitimate, he lost, usually quickly, usually by submission. Whenever he fought debut fighters or extremely weak competition, he won. Most of these fights barely had footage available, but one weakness became obvious. His ground game was a major problem, and it followed him throughout his career. Eventually, his professional record sat at 7 wins and 8 losses. Now, imagine being in his position. Your dream is to reach the UFC, but every serious test ends in defeat. At this point, most fighters either quit or completely rebuild their skills. Shatakov chose a third option. He decided to rebuild his career without actually improving as a fighter. His first move was surprisingly simple. He changed his name. Artur Shatakov legally became Askar Mazharov. The idea was clear. Start fresh, separate the new identity from the losing record. It sounds clever, until databases immediately connected the two identities. The losses followed him. So, if he couldn't erase his past with a name change, he needed a new strategy. And this is where things allegedly went completely off the rails. Mazharov and his team allegedly started contacting fight record databases like Sherdog and Tapology. Their goal? Remove losses and reshape his history. The first target was a loss in Thailand against Marcelo Tenorio. Mazharov reportedly tried emailing record keepers while pretending to be the promoter of the event. He claimed the fight never happened and should be removed. There was just one problem. He used a Russian email address while pretending to represent a Thai promotion, and actual fight footage existed showing him getting submitted. Not exactly airtight deception.
Stop it. Get some help.
Instead of stopping, the attempts became more elaborate. Another loss in China was targeted. This time, fake fight posters were created. A random YouTube fight clip was submitted as proof he wasn't involved. Unfortunately, investigators quickly noticed the promotion logo was wrong. The official event poster proved he was scheduled to fight, and once again, real footage existed showing him losing. It was basically fraud attempts being dismantled step by step. But here's the scary part. Not every attempt failed. Some wins slipped into his record unnoticed. Some losses quietly disappeared. And because smaller promotions often lack proper archives, verifying everything became extremely difficult. Over time, Mozarov's records started looking dramatically better. What once stood around 7 and 8 slowly transformed into something far more impressive. Eventually, he was being presented as a fighter with roughly 25 wins and only 7 losses. That is a massive difference. And apparently, it was convincing enough, because in 2021, Mozarov signed with the UFC. To most fans, he looked like a normal international signing. The UFC signs dozens of fighters with similar records every year. Nothing seemed suspicious at first. He was scheduled to debut multiple times, but fights fell through due to visa issues and inquiries, which ironically delayed the inevitable exposure. Because once he was finally scheduled to fight Alonzo Menefield, people started paying attention. Journalists researched him. Gamblers researched him. Hardcore MMA fans researched him. And suddenly, the entire record started falling apart. Investigators discovered some of his wins came from a completely fictional promotion called Mong Mong Championship. It sounded legitimate because it shared initials with a real promotion, but the organization basically didn't exist. Another alleged victory supposedly took place at a venue that had been permanently closed months before the event. At that point, the entire situation turned into chaos. Between signing with the UFC and actually making his debut, his record dropped from 25-7 to 19-12. 11 fight results were either removed or corrected. That is almost unheard of at the highest level of MMA. Heading into his UFC debut, Mozarov faced intense questioning about his record. His explanations included blaming Chinese promoters, blaming database administrators, and claiming some losses shouldn't count because they were semi-professional fights. None of these explanations addressed the fake posters, fake footage, or impersonation accusations. But despite everything, the fight still happened. And this was his moment, the chance to prove he belonged. Mozarov stepped into the octagon against Alonzo Menefield with his reputation already destroyed. If he won, maybe everything could be forgiven. He didn't. Menefield dominated him. He was taken down repeatedly and overwhelmed with ground strikes. Mozarov landed only 2 significant strikes before losing by first-round TKO. It wasn't competitive. It wasn't controversial. It was just one-sided. And just like that, the dream ended. Less than 2 weeks later, the UFC released him. Then, things somehow got worse. He later failed a drug test and received a 6-month suspension. Since then, even more corrections have been made to his records. Some databases now list him with multiple additional losses and fewer wins. He hasn't fought professionally since. Mozarov's story sounds ridiculous, but it highlights a serious issue in MMA. The sport is global, fragmented, and often poorly regulated at lower levels. Records rely heavily on trust, promotion submissions, and incomplete archives. When fighters compete across multiple countries, promotions, and rule sets, mistakes and manipulation become easier than most fans realize. Mozarov didn't create that system, but he showed exactly how fragile it can be. He didn't win in the UFC. He didn't become a star. He barely lasted one fight. But he forced one of the biggest sports organizations in the world to face a very uncomfortable truth. Even at the highest level, scouting isn't perfect. Verification isn't perfect. And sometimes, someone determined enough can slip through the cracks. And honestly, exposing those cracks might be the most impact he ever made in MMA. Subscribe to MMA Explained for more MMA content. Also, if you are an MMA junkie, join Patreon in the description for our picks and predictions of every fight on every UFC event. Cheers.